If you've ever stood on a piece of land that's been in your family for generations, felt the dirt under your boots, and known exactly whose sweat and blood watered it before you were even born, then you know that land isn't just an asset. It's a member of the family, and you protect it like one. But if you're the type of person who thinks a property line is just a suggestion, and that the world exists solely to facilitate your morning commute to a Pilates class, well, you might want to grab a notebook, because I'm about to teach you a lesson that cost my neighbor a $100,000 luxury SUV and her dignity, all in about 30 seconds of pure, unadulterated physics. My name is Caleb, and I run the Ironwood Creek Ranch, 350 acres of rolling Texas hill country that's mostly scrub oak, limestone, and stubborn cattle. It's not a hobby farm. It's not a tax write-off. It's my life. It's where my grandfather taught me how to mend a fence before I could ride a bike. And it's where I plan to be buried one day, hopefully a long time from now. For decades, the only thing bordering my western fence line was a thicket of mesquite and the kind of silence you can't buy in a city. But about 2 years ago, the developers came. They flattened the hills, poured enough concrete to build a bunker, and slapped up a subdivision called the Gilded Oaks, which is ironic because they cut down every single oak tree to build the place. Suddenly, my quiet western border was lined with McMansions that looked like they were built out of cardboard and hubris, inhabited by folks who liked the idea of country living but hated the smell, the dust, and the people who actually worked the land. Enter Veronica St. James. Now, I try to be a good neighbor, I really do. I keep my fences tight. I keep my cows off their manicured lawns, and I don't run the thresher at dawn on Sundays. But Veronica, she was a different breed of suburban wildlife. She drove a pristine, Arctic white Mercedes G-Wagon, the kind that looks like a tank designed by Gucci, and she had an attitude to match. My first run-in with her wasn't at a block party or a town hall. It was about 50 yards inside my property line on a dirt service road that I used to move hay bales to the north pasture. I was out there fixing a gap in the barbed wire, sweat stinging my eyes, when I felt the ground vibrate. I looked up, expecting to see my foreman's truck, but instead, I see this white geometric brick bouncing down my tractor ruts, kicking up a cloud of dust that was settling nicely onto my fresh alfalfa. She pulled up right next to me, the window sliding down with that silent, expensive hum. And there she was, oversized sunglasses, a latte in one hand, and a look on her face like she was smelling something rotten. "Excuse me," she said, and it wasn't a question, it was a summons. "Is this path going to connect to the county highway? My navigation says if I cut through here, I can bypass the school's own traffic." I stood there for a second, just blinking, trying to process the sheer audacity of it. "Ma'am," I said, leaning on my fence post, "this isn't a path. This is a ranch. You are currently driving through a cow pasture. The highway is 3 miles back the way you came." She let out this little huff, like a deflating tire. "Well, that's ridiculous. Look at the map." She waved her phone at me. "It clearly shows a connecting line. I'm already late for my spin class, so if you could just move your truck, I'll be out of your hair." "My truck isn't moving," I told her, my voice dropping that octave that usually tells people to tread lightly. "And neither are you. Not forward anyway. You need to turn around. This is private property, posted and fenced. You're trespassing." She looked at me over the rim of those sunglasses, and I swear she looked at me like I was a piece of landscaping that had grown out of control. "You don't have to be so rude," she snapped. "It's just dirt. It's not like I'm hurting your precious grass." Then, without another word, she rolled the window up. I thought she was going to turn around. Instead, she cranked the wheel hard to the left, drove off the track, crushed a patch of wildflowers my late wife used to love, circled around my pickup truck, and gunned it down the rest of the track, disappearing over the hill in a spray of gravel. I stood there, jaw hanging loose, watching her taillights fade. I thought, okay, surely that's a what I'm thing. Surely nobody is that entitled. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. That unauthorized shortcut became her daily ritual. Every morning at 8:15 a.m., the white G-Wagon would come barreling through. She was saving maybe for minutes on her commute, but to her, those for minutes were worth more than my property rights. I tried the polite route first. I went to the hardware store and bought the biggest, ugliest nitrogen monoxide trespassing signs they had. I bolted them to the fence posts right where she was entering from the cul-de-sac. 2 days later, I found them in the ditch, bent in half, with tire tracks running right over the word prosecuted. That was the first time I felt the anger really settle in hot and heavy in my gut. It wasn't just about the grass or the dust anymore. It was the disrespect. It was the message she was sending. Your world doesn't matter. My convenience is law. I decided to escalate things through the proper channels. I sat in my truck one morning and blocked the road physically. When she pulled up, she didn't even roll down her window. She just laid on the horn a long, blaring note that scared the heifers in the next field over. When I didn't move, she reversed, drove through a gap in the fence I hadn't fixed yet, and tore across the open meadow, leaving deep ruts in the soft earth. I called the HOA president, a guy named Preston who sounded like he wore a tie to bed. Mr. Dalton. Preston sighed over the phone. Sounding board. We can't control what residents do outside the community gates. And honestly, Veronica has mentioned that your property is an eyesore. Maybe if you paved that road, it wouldn't be such an issue. Have you considered being more neighborly? Neighborly. Paving my ranch so a suburban princess could get to the gym faster. I hung up before I said something that would get me on a watch list. Next, I called the sheriff's department. Deputy Martinez came out. A good kid I've known since he was in 4-H. He looked at the tracks, looked at the bent signs, and shook his head. Caleb, I can go talk to her, give her a warning. But unless I catch her doing it, or unless you have a gate she physically breaks, it's a civil dispute. It's your word against hers until you get a court order. And you know the courts are backed up 6 months. So, the law was too slow, the HOA was complicit, and Veronica St. James felt invincible. I watched her the next day through my binoculars from the porch. She was flying down that dirt track, coffee in hand, head bopping to music I couldn't hear, treating my legacy like her personal expressway. She thought she had one. She thought I was just some old cowboy she could steamroll because she had a better lawyer and a bigger car, but she forgot one thing. Farmers and ranchers were essentially engineers with dirt under our fingernails. We move earth, we divert water, we manage soil. And if she wanted to treat my service road like a public highway, well, it was high time that road underwent some critical infrastructure maintenance. I called up my buddy Silas. Silas is 80 years old, walks with a cane, and knows more about hydrology and soil mechanics than anyone with a PhD. I told him the situation, told him about the white G-Wagon and the crushed wildflowers. Silas didn't say a word for a long time, just chewed on his toothpick. Then a slow, terrifying grin spread across his face. Caleb, he wheezed, you got a drainage problem on that north track. I can see it from here. The soil is too compacted. You need to air it, deep air it, and you need to install some erosion control measures. Big ones, erosion control, I repeated, catching his drift. Yeah, Silas chuckled. And maybe a moisture retention system. You know, for the drought. We spent the next 3 days planning it. This wasn't going to be a simple roadblock she could drive around. This was going to be a trap, a masterpiece of agricultural engineering designed to catch exactly one species of pest. I went to see my lawyer, Gentle Ben, just to make sure I wasn't going to prison. Ben laughed so hard he spilled his coffee. Caleb, he said, wiping his eyes, as long as you put up signage clear. Visible signage warning of hazardous conditions and road construction. You are fully within your rights to modify your own land. If she ignores the signs and drives into a construction zone, that's on her. Just don't dig a tiger pit with spikes. Keep it agricultural, I said. You got it. Phase 1 was the signage. I didn't mess around this time. I got industrial orange construction signs. Danger, open trench, caution, heavy equipment operation, severe tire damage ahead. I posted them at the entrance from the cul-de-sac, and I posted another set 50 feet down the track. You would have to be blind or catastrophically stupid to miss them. Phase 2 was the terrain modification. I hooked up the Ripper plow to my biggest John Deere. This isn't a normal plow. It's got shanks that go 3 feet deep to break up hardpan soil. I drove it up and down the first 100 yards of the track, but I didn't smooth it out after. I left it as a washboard deep, jagged furrows of hardened clay that ran perpendicular to the road. It looked passable if you were going slow in a tractor, but if you hit it at 30 miles an hour in a sport-tuned SUV, it was going to feel like driving down a flight of stairs. Phase 3 was the rock garden. I went down to the creek bed and loaded the front-end loader with river rocks cantaloupe-sized. Smooth, but hard as iron, I scattered them through the middle section of the track, half buried. From a distance, they just looked like gravel. Up close, they were an undercarriage's worst nightmare, lurking just high enough to snag a muffler or crack an oil pan, if you didn't have the clearance of a monster truck. But Phase 4 was the clincher. There was a low spot in the road where water naturally pooled. I dug it out, making it about 2 feet deeper, a nice gentle slopin', but a steep, slick slope out. I ran a hose from the cattle trough and filled it until the dirt turned into a thick, sucking clay gumbo. It looked like a puddle. It was actually a pit of despair. And just to be absolutely sure, just to add that little chef's kiss of justice, I went to the manure pile. We'd been mucking out the barns all week. I took a scoop of the freshest, most potent, ammonia-rich cow manure you can imagine, and I spread a nice, thick layer of it on the dry ground immediately after the mud pit. If she got stuck, she wouldn't be stepping out onto grass. She'd be stepping out into the reality of ranch life. I finished the work on a Wednesday evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over my handiwork. It looked innocent, dangerous if you knew what to look for. But to the untrained eye of a suburbanite who thinks milk comes from a carton, it just looked like a messy dirt road. I took photos. I took videos. I documented the signs, the depth of the ruts, the timestamp. I was ready. Thursday morning broke clear and cool. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, grabbed my binoculars, and sat on the porch swing. I felt a calm sort of anticipation, like a hunter in a deer blind. 8:10 a.m., nothing. 8:13 a.m., a squirrel ran across the fence. 8:15 a.m., I heard it. The aggressive, high-pitched whine of a German-engineered engine accelerating. The white G-Wagon turned off the cul-de-sac. She paused for maybe half a second at the entrance. She had to have seen the bright orange danger signs. I saw her brake lights flicker. This was her chance. She could turn around. She could go the long way. She could admit that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't built for her. But then, the nose of that SUV dipped as she punched the gas. She decided the signs were a bluff. She decided she knew better. She hit the washboard section at about 35 miles an hour. Through the binoculars, it was like watching a cartoon. The car didn't just bounce. It shuddered violently. I saw her head whipping back and forth like a bobblehead in an earthquake. The suspension on those luxury cars is stiff, meant for the Autobahn, not for deep-tilled Texas clay. She slammed on the brakes, but skidded over the ridges, shaking the fillings out of her teeth. She slowed down, swerving left and right, trying to find a smooth path. There wasn't one. She was committed now. She crawled forward, angry, probably screaming into her hands-free phone. Then she reached the rock garden. K-thunk. The sound carried all the way to the porch. It was the sickening, metal-on-rock sound of a differential meeting geology. She had bottomed out. She gunned it, scraping over the stones, sparks probably flying underneath where she couldn't see them. She was damaging the car. She knew it, but her pride wouldn't let her stop. She was almost through. She just had to get past the puddle. She saw the water. She hesitated. Then, she did exactly what people who don't know how to drive off-road do. She tried to use momentum. She floored it. The G-Wagon hit the soup bowl. Splosh. Mud flew 20 feet in the air, coating the pristine white paint in a layer of brown slime. The front end dived into the soft clay. The momentum carried her forward about 10 feet, and then physics took over. The suction of the clay grabbed those low-profile street tires, which instantly slicked over. The car stopped dead. The engine roared a high, whining scream of frustration as she floored the gas pedal. The wheels spun. Mud sprayed in high, majestic arcs, raining down on the roof, the hood, the windshield. The car didn't move an inch forward. It just sank, down, 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 until the frame was resting comfortably on the mud. She was high-centered. She was stuck. She was properly, undeniably anchored in the earth she had disrespected for weeks. I took a sip of my coffee. It was the best cup of coffee I have ever tasted in my life. I watched the driver's door open. Pushing heavily against the mud that was already piled up to the rocker panels. Veronica emerged, or at least, she tried to. She stepped 1 foot out, looking for solid ground. But she didn't realize that in my master plan, the solid ground next to the mud pit was the landing zone for the manure spreader. She planted a designer boot, something that probably cost more than my first truck, directly into 6 inches of semi-liquid, sun-warmed cow manure. I heard the scream from 300 yards away. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of pure, unfiltered outrage. It was the sound of a universe shattering because it refused to conform to her will. She tried to pull her foot back, but the suction was real. She stumbled, flailing her arms for balance, and had to grab the muddy door frame of her $100,000 paperweight to keep from face-planting into the muck. She stood there, 1 foot in the clay, 1 foot in the manure, her white pants splattered with brown sludge, realizing the tactical error of her life. She couldn't go forward. She couldn't go backward. She couldn't get back in the car without ruining the white leather interior. She was trapped in a prison of her own making. I figured it was time to be neighborly. I put my coffee cup down, walked to my old Ford, the one with the dents and the character, and drove slowly down the fence line. I didn't take the track. I drove on the grass beside it, nice and smooth. I pulled up about 20 feet from her, rolled down the window, and tipped my hat. "Morning, Veronica," I called out, keeping my face deadpan. "Seems you ran into a bit of trouble. Did you miss the hazardous conditions signs back there? They're bright orange. Hard to miss." She spun around, her face a mask of purple rage and mascara streaks. "You," she shrieked, pointing a shaking, muddy finger at me. "You did this. You sabotaged the road. This is a trap. I'm going to sue you for everything you own. Do you see my car? Do you see my boots?" "I see 'em," I said calmly, leaning an arm out the window. "I also see you standing in the middle of an agricultural improvement zone. I'm preparing this field for winter rye. That mud is for moisture retention. Those rocks are for drainage. And that stuff you're standing in, that's premium fertilizer. You're trespassing on an active worksite, ma'am. I'm calling the police." She yelled, fumbling for her phone with muddy hands. "I'm calling my lawyer. You're going to jail." "You go ahead and call," I said. "But you might want to call a tow truck first. And tell them to bring the long cable. It's deep in there." She dialed 911 right in front of me, screaming about being held hostage and attacked. I just waited. About 40 minutes later, Deputy Martinez rolled up to the fence line. He parked on the dry grass, stepped out, and tipped his hat to me. Then he looked at the G-Wagon, buried to the axles. He looked at the orange signs fluttering in the breeze behind her. He looked at Veronica, who was practically vibrating with fury. "Officer," she yelled, "arrest him. He dug a hole in the road. He destroyed my car." Martinez walked over, testing the ground carefully with his boot. He looked at the road closed sign she had driven past. He looked back at her. "Ma'am," Martinez said, his voice tired, "I told you last week this was private property. I see clear signage warning of hazards. You drove past a barricade into a construction zone, but he did it on purpose." She wailed, "It's his land." Martinez shrugged. "He can dig holes to China if he wants to, as long as he puts up a sign. You're the one who drove into it. Technically, you're trespassing. I could cite you for that right now." The color drained from her face. "But I'm stuck." "Yes, ma'am, you are," Martinez agreed. "I suggest you call a recovery service. The sheriff's department doesn't pull civilians out of mud pits." The tow truck arrived an hour later. It was a big flatbed run by a guy named Bubba who charged stupidity rates. Because the G-Wagon was so deep, and because the ground was so slick, Bubba couldn't get close. He had to winch it out. He hooked the chains to her rear axle, which was buried in the clay, and started pulling. The sound was excruciating. Scray up. The G-Wagon was dragged backward over the rock garden. I saw the muffler rip loose and stay behind like a fallen soldier. I saw the front bumper catch on a rock and snap off with a loud crack. By the time that car was back on solid ground, The undercarriage looked like it had been chewed on by a T-Rex. Veronica sat in the cab of the tow truck, refusing to look at me, furiously typing on her phone. Bubba handed her a bill that made her eyes bulge. She signed it with a stab of the pen dot as they drove away. I walked over to the mud pit. It was a mess, but it was a beautiful mess. I retrieved the plastic bumper piece she left behind. A souvenir. The legal threat came 3 days later. A courier delivered a thick envelope from a downtown law firm. Demand for compensation, it said. She wanted $50,000 for the car repairs, $5,000 for emotional distress, and $2,000 for the ruined boots. I drove the paperwork over to my lawyer. Ben added my photos of the signs, the video from my trail cam showing her driving past the warnings, and a counterclaim for damage to soil integrity and cost of re-leveling agricultural land. We went to small claims court because the damages she claimed were technically high, but the Judge Harrelson, a man who owns a ranch himself, decided. To hear the preliminary motions, I'll never forget the look on Judge Harrelson's face when he looked at the photo of the Orange Danger sign and then the photo of the white car buried in the mud. He looked over his glasses at Veronica, who was dressed in her best victim outfit. Mrs. St. James, the judge said, his voice like gravel. Let me get this straight. You drove onto a private ranch. You ignored a sign that said severe tire damage. You ignored a sign that said road closed. And then you drove into a hole. And now you want the landowner to pay for it. It was a trap, she insisted. He knew I drove there. If I dig a swimming pool in my backyard and put up a fence, the judge said, leaning forward, and you break through the fence and dive into the empty concrete hole, are you going to sue the pool boy? Ma'am, you were trespassing. Case dismissed with prejudice. And frankly, you're lucky Mr. Dalton isn't suing you for polluting his field with that leaking transmission fluid. He banged the gavel. It sounded like victory. The aftermath was quiet. The G-Wagon disappeared, replaced by a sensible sedan that stays strictly on the pavement. The HOA president, Preston, suddenly found the budget to send out a newsletter reminding all residents to respect the boundaries of our rural neighbors. As for the track, I let nature take it back. I planted blackberries along the edges, big, thorny thickets that grow fast and bite hard. The ruts filled in with grass. The wildflowers came back, sometimes in the evenings. I sit on the porch and look out toward the west. The sun sets over the gilded oaks, and for a moment, the McMansions look almost pretty in the golden light. I haven't seen Veronica since court. I hear she takes the long way round now. It adds 10 minutes to her commute, but I reckon that gives her plenty of time to think about the difference between a right-of-way and a wrong turn. We live in a world where people think they can push and push, that rules are for other people, and that boundaries are just lines in the dirt waiting to be crossed. But out here, the dirt pushes back. So, here's the question for you folks. Was I too harsh? Should I have just let her keep using the road and swallowed my pride? Or did Veronica get exactly the muddy, expensive reality check she deserved? Let me know in the comments. And remember, good fences make good neighbors, but a well-placed mud pit makes for a quiet afternoon. Thanks for listening.